All right, so I'm going to be brief, hopefully. I'm usually to the point and pretty data driven. And what I want to talk about today is the detriment of masking. And when I think about this, I really think about our children because we're forcing them to do something. You're an adult, you can quit your job, you can walk away, you can do many things. But our children have been placed in harm's way, especially. And especially when I think about the psychological impacts of children that really psychologically need to be in a school environment with other children, that psychologically need to be in a sport. And so they're willing to play the sport with the mask on, which puts the parent in a terrible position, knowing the deep psychological need on one hand and the potential physical harm on the other. Much like much of what has happened when I, first of all, I was like Megan Kelly and Tammy. I didn't think there was any way they were going to mask people. It was just so ludicrous at every level. We know that viruses go through N95 mask and that the N95 mask, actually you breathe out the virus. It's to protect you, not to protect others, right? So we knew that the masks were ineffective. I couldn't even have that conversation for 6 months because it just seemed nonsensical to me. So we've known from the beginning, and anybody who was trained as we were knew. And that's why it was such a smack in the face, because this should be obvious to anyone who's trained in similar fields. And so I felt the same way. You heard during Dr. Jackson's talk, those children saying, well, I can't breathe. Well, no shit, Sherlock. You've got something covering your mouth and nose. I mean, this is not that complicated, right? And so, but yet we're acting like, what do you mean you can't breathe because you're running in the rain cross country with a wet mask on your mouth? Like, I'm just, and the moms, it's like, we're standing back when we really just needed to slap somebody upside the head. All right, so now I'll get a little bit more into the deep biochemistry of this. What signals our body on whether we are getting enough oxygen or not? It's not actually our oxygen concentration, it's our carbon dioxide concentration. When our carbon dioxide concentration goes up too high, it signals our body, hey, you need more oxygen. What should you do? You should breathe. You should breathe faster. You should breathe deeper. And so usually that's enough to bring the body back into homeostasis. What is homeostasis? It means balance, but it's really a deeper balance. It's a biochemical balance. And when your body's not in balance, if it gets too far out of balance, you actually die. If you've ever, like I'm about 50 years old, if you've ever been out of homeostasis because of hormonal problems or not being able to breathe, you feel like you're going to die. And so it's really important to maintain that balance, to maintain that homeostasis. So when someone has a mask on, and everyone's biochemistry is different, so some people are going to be far more susceptible than others, and your carbon dioxide raises to a certain level, it triggers a homeostatic response that says, breathe deeper, breathe faster. And so you breathe deeper and breathe faster. What does that do? That makes more carbon dioxide that tells your body to do the exact same thing. So pretty soon you're kind of hyperventilating in your mask. And for many people, it's, you're not getting enough oxygen. And so you have an anxiety attack, a panic attack, and there's just a feeling of not being able to breathe. And yet we're telling our children to harm themselves. They know they're harming themselves at either a conscious or unconscious level, and just to keep doing it. That's grooming. All right. So increased carbon dioxide tells the body to try to get more oxygen by increasing respiration and to establish homeostasis. So now you're hyperventilating, and it also increases your heart rate because it's like we need more oxygen to the tissues. It's assuming that you don't have something covering your mouth, because who would be that stupid? All right, your body's assuming that. So you're going to take in more oxygen, but you're not taking more oxygen. So it's going to increase your heart rate in order to get that oxygen to the tissues. Except for you're not taking in more oxygen. You're breathing more CO2. So now you're hyperventilating, you've got increased heart rate and increased cardiac output. You have put the body under a lot of cardiovascular stress. So I allowed my 18-year-old to work with a mask on, very light work, mostly standing around, because he was 18. My daughter is epileptic. Under no circumstances would I allow her to wear a mask. My son, I'm like, yeah, if you wanted to go to war and get shot at, I'd let you do that too. And I'm not sure which, which is worse, right? Um, but, I once had a student tell me, well, I OD'd on cocaine. Why am I still alive? And I said, well, because you're 18, right? An 18-year-old standing around in a mask is not the same as a 45-year-old or a 65-year-old or someone with hypertension or someone with diabetes, all right? All of these things need to be taken into account. So now you're hyperventilating, you've got increased heart rate, increased cardiac output, your body is under cardiovascular stress. And in extreme cases, depending on your pathophysiology, your age, your physical conditioning, you can go into cardiac overload. In extreme cases, you can go into respiratory arrest, and this is going to be most likely under exercise conditions. And I have to tell you, my son ran cross country. I remember his first race. I was really hopeful because he's Ethiopian and we know they can fly. And he didn't come in first or second or even 30th. But when he came in, his eyes were as big as saucers. And he was like, Mom, that is the hardest thing I have ever done. And so luckily he had gone on to college. As I watched on YouTube as children were wearing masks in the rain so that they had no permeability while running 3 miles cross country. What the fuck is wrong with us? And like many of us, I hadn't sworn for about 20 years. I decided it was inappropriate, right? Not very professional. But at some point, you've just like, what? All right, so under these conditions of hypercapnia, you are making so much CO2 that, yes, you can go under respiratory arrest. At a previous function that we had earlier this year, that happened to a student. And he is forever changed. He is forever disabled because he went past that threshold. And when you get past that threshold, you go into cardiac arrest. Then you're talking about ischemia. You're talking about lack of oxygen. You're talking about brain damage, permanent brain damage from lack of oxygen. Now, my physiological, biochemical opinion is that any kid that is wearing a mask, and probably any human being, 8 hours a day or 6 hours a day without proper ventilation is probably having some level of brain damage, all right? Some level of damage, all right? Maybe low level, but that's also going to depend on their particular biochemical state and their pathophysiology. What have they got going on? All right, so there are extreme cases, but most of the time we're talking about chronic high CO2. You're wearing a mask all day. You're experiencing high carbon dioxide all day. That's called hypercapnia. So I'm going to repeat that word many times. What are the effects of chronic hypercapnia? Well, we actually have a model. COPD is a model of chronic hypercapnia because there is not sufficient gas exchange. So what do we see in people where we have models? Sleep apnea is also another model. All right, so we know what this looks like in people. We know that hypercapnia or increased CO2 impairs kidneys functions. Your kidneys are actually trying to decrease the level of acidity in your blood, and so they're actually really doing a lot to retain, basically to balance the pH. And so it really puts a lot of stress on the kidneys to balance the pH and balance your salt. And it reduces blood flow to the kidneys. And it actually, in many cases, can lead to chronic kidney inflammation, which we refer to nephritis. No one's even talking about this. Anybody measuring in our kids? No, I don't think so. All right. We have a sleep apnea model of hypercapnia, and that also causes a lack of oxygen. And what they see in these people is altered postural stability, altered ability to sense their environment, known as proprioception, altered gait, and increased falls. All right, and this is what it looks like when your brain's not getting an oxygen. This isn't rocket science, okay? In the context of our children, their brains are still developing. And yet we think it's okay to deprive them chronically of oxygen. We have mitochondria that produce our energy, and there's biochemical evidence that this is damaging the mitochondria because they're trying to work in an environment where it doesn't have what it needs. Again, the body is out of homeostasis, and it's put in a place where it's constantly trying to adjust, but it can't adjust because you won't take the mask off. My daughter, as I said, is epileptic and she has seizures. I was stunned when her neurologist was willing to actually give a written statement that said that there was no way that the mask wearing could induce seizures. When you just heard Dr. Avery Jackson say that as you take off the mask and the oxygen comes back, and I can think of many biochemical mechanisms for this, it can trigger seizures. I knew that. I had the scientific papers that I actually sent to them. That didn't bother them at all. Of course, there was no way I was going to send my child to school with a mask. All right, one of the more concerning aspects of chronic hypercapnia is acidosis. This is the increase of carbonic acid as you put CO2 into the system. And we know that when the body becomes chronically acidic, it is permissive for cancer. How do we know this? Because we see it in the COPD model, that they have higher rates of cancer due to chronic hypercapnia. We've already seen skyrocketing increases in the rates of cancer in our children. Our school is in a very small town, and the whole time I've been there have been at least 3 children at any given time with cancer in a school of 300 children. That alone is not acceptable, and we should be looking at why. And then we're going to mask our children, knowing that if they have cancer, it's going to be very permissive and feed that cancer, knowing that it may be permissive for getting cancer, because we are 2.5 years out. When are we going to stand up? All right, so if you are a medical professional, you may be thinking, yeah, like you're full of it, because we know that permissive hypercapnia can be anti-inflammatory. So if you're having surgery, a lot of times they'll actually permit a certain increase in CO2 in your body because it's anti-inflammatory. And when you're having surgery or something, that can be helpful for the short term. However, even in that case, they still see that hypercapnia leads to pulmonary edema, which means fluid in your lungs. They still see that it actually reduces cellular healing in the lungs as well. So even though it has some benefits because it's anti-inflammatory, it's a mixed response. However, what about chronic hypercapnia? Increases in CO2 shut down, the reason it's anti-inflammatory is it shuts down a gene called NF-kappa B. And this is related to cytokine signaling because NF-kappa B is the gene that needs to be turned on to turn on all your inflammatory cytokines. Well, you're like, well, we don't want to turn on inflammatory cytokines. Well, if you're in the middle of COVID, you don't want them to get any higher. But what if you actually contract some sort of bacterial infection or viral infection? You actually do want to turn on your immune system. So what chronic hypercapnia does is it turns down or inhibits this gene, and it is immunosuppressive. We know it's immunosuppressive because, again, we have these models of COPD where we see an immunosuppressive effect that is followed by increased incidence of chronic lung bacterial infections, increases in the number of bacterial infections in people who are chronically hypercapnic. So we've put a mask on our kids that they're breathing into, getting nice and wet all day, walking to the bathroom, dropping on the floor, picking it up, putting it back on their face, breathing, moist environment, and then we'll suppress their immune system during a pandemic. Brilliant. All right, so as I said, the immunosuppressive effects of chronic hypercapnia are not theoretical. We've actually seen this in this model of COPD. The next thing I want to talk about is exercising with a mask. Again, my son had cross country, so I actually saw some of these cases where they were running cross country with mask on. And we're just fortunate that more kids didn't have very critical reactions to that. All right. When you have acute hypercapnia, and so this is generally exercise induced, and we're seeing our kids play basketball with masks on. This acute hypercapnia impairs electrical signaling in the heart. It impairs electrical signaling in the heart. I'm not going to go into all of the potassium and the calcium and the sodium, all right? But that data is out there. We know that it results in irregular heartbeat. It results in fluttering of the heart, which is tachycardia, increased heart rate. And it predisposes to sudden cardiac death. Now, again, this is going to be rare, But when you're talking about something that's completely preventable because nobody needs to be running back and forth on the basketball court with a mask on, it's inexcusable. And it's inexcusable that we don't go and slap somebody upside the head for trying to make our children do this. All right, it significantly disrupts, as again, ion and salt balance, all of this membrane polarization by which the heart signals and starts knowing when to contract and when to release, when to contract and when to release. It screws it up, and that's why it contributes to sudden cardiac arrest. It can also, as I said, when you get CO2 above a certain level, it actually signals the brain. The brain is trying to slow the metabolism down because it's saying you don't have enough oxygen to do what you're doing, but your will is keeping you doing it anyway. And so eventually it just says, okay, I'm just shutting this off. You have respiratory arrest, and now nobody's getting any oxygen until either somebody restarts your heart. Now, if you're 18, your heart probably will restart, but how much damage will have been done in the interim? And that's what we need to be asking. As we comply, how much damage is being done in the interim? Mask wearing is putting our kids at risk for chronic respiratory, cardiorespiratory stress, for hypoxia, which is low oxygen, for impaired kidney function and kidney inflammation, for altered posture, gait, and sensing, as Dr. Jackson was talking about, for all sorts of brain dysfunction and lowered function of the brain, for seizures in those who are predisposed, for acidosis, which is permissive for cancer growth, for immunosuppression during a pandemic, and for increased bacterial infection and other infection. And in extreme cases, usually involving exercise, the possibility of respiratory arrest, brain damage, and even sudden cardiac death. What the hell are we thinking? Our children who are not at risk for severe COVID and don't have enough ACE2 receptors in their lungs to sustain an active infection in the lungs and cause lung symptoms are the ones that we're masking every day in school because they can't say no or quit their job. It is time for us to stand up and actually follow the science and just say no more. Thank you.